as inevitable as the sunrise. He was the golden boy of the Hohenzollern dynasty, the dashing future of the most terrifying military power in Europe. But life did not go according to the script. Instead of a glorious coronation, his existence became a long, agonizing slide into irrelevance. He didn't die dramatically in a bunker or on a scaffold like other great failures of history. His end was heartbreakingly ordinary, a heart attack in a modest villa, alone with his memories, decades after his name had lost all its weight. His entire life was programmed for a throne that vanished before he could even touch it, turning him into a living relic, an antique that continued to breathe long after its era had died. He became a ghost haunting his own homeland, desperately trying to find a role, any role, in a Germany that had already violently rejected everything his family stood for. To understand the tragedy of the fall awaiting Wilhelm, we must travel back in time to the zenith of the German Empire in the late 19th century, where the Prussian monarchy stood at the absolute height of its power. On May 6, 1882, at the Marble Palace in Potsdam, Wilhelm's birth was greeted by cannon thunder and pealing bells ringing across the empire. This baby was not merely a human being. He was a living insurance policy for the House of Hohenzollern, a guarantee that the blood of Frederick the Great would continue to flow. His future was carved in stone before he even opened his eyes. He would be King of Prussia, German Emperor, and Supreme Warlord. However, the tragedy began right in the cradle, under the colossal shadow of his father, Kaiser Wilhelm II, haunted by deep insecurity stemming from his own physical disability. The Kaiser viewed his son not as an independent child, but as a tool to mold the perfect Prussian soldier he himself could never be. The childhood of Little Willie was a harsh military campaign designed to annihilate the self. The nursery was replaced by a drill square, toys were replaced by miniature rifles, and every display of weakness was punished under the cold maxim, "A Hohenzollern does not cry." Beneath this rigid shell, Wilhelm actually possessed a sensitive, artistic soul that loved music and the theater. But when the Kaiser discovered and brutally crushed these effeminate interests, Wilhelm learned a painful lesson. His true self was unacceptable. To survive, he donned the mask of an arrogant, shallow, and skeptical heir, envy-inducing to his father, and shut out from real power. Wilhelm channeled his energy into speed, sports, and women, becoming the globally notorious Playboy Prince, a quiet act of rebellion to assert his own existence. His 1905 marriage to Duchess Cecilia created the image of the monarchy's golden couple, but boredom quickly returned. Excluded from state affairs and desperate to prove his manhood, Wilhelm naively allowed himself to be swept up by the extreme right-wing military faction preaching inevitable war. He became the figurehead of the war party in Berlin, praising conflict as a cleansing fire, completely oblivious to the industrial reality of modern warfare. He was a 19th century romantic hurtling toward the 20th century machine of destruction. When the assassination in Sarajevo ignited World War I, Wilhelm felt not dread, but a thrill. He believed glory awaited. In August 1914, amidst delirious cheering, the mobilization became a spectacle of mass hysteria. Trains rolled out of Berlin chocked with slogans like "To Paris" and "To St. Petersburg." Wilhelm was given command of the Fifth Army, a massive responsibility placing hundreds of thousands of lives in the hands of a man whose experience was limited to parade grounds. As he boarded the train, waving his cap in the summer sun, he felt a sense of supreme purpose, envisioning a swift campaign and a triumphant return by Christmas. But as the whistle blew and the skyline of Berlin disappeared behind a plume of steam, He was merely a product of centuries of breeding, hurtling toward a technological apocalypse. The train itself was a moving capsule of a dying world, filled with champagne, expensive tobacco, and obsolete maps, carrying him from a golden cage straight into the iron cage of a cruel destiny. Heading to command the Fifth Army as the anvil of the Schlieffen Plan, he quickly found his authority overshadowed by his chief of staff, Knobelsdorff, a cold professional assigned by the general staff to act as the brain to the prince's reckless face. While early victories at Longwy earned him the title of warrior prince and fueled a propaganda frenzy, the romantic illusion of 19th century cavalry charges shattered at the Battle of the Marne. The war of movement died, forcing the German army to dig in, trapping Wilhelm in the mud and misery of static trench warfare. As the stalemate dragged on, the contrast in Wilhelm's life became grotesque. While his men froze in waterlogged trenches, he lived in a requisitioned French chateau, numbing the emptiness of his puppet command with alcohol and women. Desperate to break the deadlock and restore his fading reputation, he agreed to General Falkenhayn's monstrous plan to attack the sacred fortress of Verdun to bleed the French army white. In February 1916, thousands of German guns turned the landscape into a lunar hellscape. Initial successes like the capture of Fort Douaumont tricked Wilhelm into believing victory was at hand. But the iron will of the French defense soon turned the battlefield into a vast, inescapable factory of death. Verdun quickly spiraled into a humanitarian nightmare that swallowed the elite of the German army and ravaged Wilhelm's body and soul. Though he grew physically gaunt and privately begged to stop the senseless slaughter, bound by the rigid code of duty and subservience to the Kaiser, he continued to sign the orders for one more push. By late 1916, when the ruthless duo of Hindenburg and Ludendorff took command and stripped him of his remaining power, the French had recaptured almost all the lost ground. The campaign ended with absolute zero strategic gain, paid for with mountains of corpses. Wilhelm emerged from 1916 not as the arrogant playboy, but as a broken man. Reviled by the world as the butcher of Verdun, he was in reality its most high-profile casualty, a soul permanently cauterized by the very fire he had once eagerly sought. The year 1917 dawned over Europe not with the rising sun of hope, but with the gray, suffocating fog of exhaustion. If 1914 was the year of enthusiastic delusion, and 1916 was the year of industrial slaughter, 1917 was the year the soul of the German Empire began to freeze to death. Crown Prince Wilhelm, the man who had ridden to war expecting a summer campaign, was now a specter haunting the headquarters of Army Group Crown Prince. The failure at Verdun had changed him fundamentally. The rakish tilt of his cap was still there, a habit of muscle memory, but the eyes beneath the brim were different. They were the eyes of a man who had seen the future and realized with a chilling certainty that there was no place in it for him. The war had mutated. It was no longer a contest between princes and generals. It had become a war of machines and starving populations. In Berlin, the power had shifted decisively. The Kaiser, Wilhelm's father, had become a shadow. The supreme warlord was now a figurehead, his bombastic speeches sounding increasingly shrill and desperate against the silence of the casualty lists. The real power lay in the hands of the Third Supreme Command, Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg, and his quartermaster general, Erich Ludendorff. For the Crown Prince, the rise of Hindenburg and Ludendorff was a personal and political catastrophe. These two men were the embodiment of a new, ruthless professionalism. Hindenburg, the towering wooden idol of the German people, and Ludendorff, The frantic, brilliant, obsessive technocrat had no patience for royal prerogatives. They viewed the war as a total struggle for existence, one that required the complete mobilization of society. To them, the crown prince was an amateur, a relic of a decorative era that was hindering the efficiency of the war machine. Wilhelm felt this disdain acutely. At strategy conferences, Ludendorff would often talk over him, dismissing his concerns about troop morale or supply shortages with a wave of his hand. The crown prince was reduced to a high-ranking spectator, forced to sign orders he often disagreed with, bound by a code of dynastic loyalty that felt increasingly like a suicide pact. He was the heir to the throne, yet he had less actual influence than a staff major in the operations department. But the greatest horror of 1917 was not found in the strategy rooms. It was found in the soup kitchens of Berlin. The Allied naval blockade was strangling Germany. The turnip winter of 1916 to 1917 had arrived. The potato crop had failed, and the German people, the proud subjects of the Hohenzollern Empire, were reduced to eating Swedes, fodder normally reserved for the pigs. From his headquarters, Wilhelm received letters from his wife Cecilia detailing the misery in the capital. Children were fainting in schools from hunger. Old women were fighting in the streets over scraps of coal. The infant mortality rate was skyrocketing. The golden bond between the dynasty and the people was dissolving in a vat of watery turnip soup. The crown prince, to his credit, was not blind to this. He warned his father that the mood on the home front was turning dangerous. "The people are starving, Papa," he wrote. "They will not endure this forever." But the Kaiser, insulated in his headquarters at Pless, surrounded by sycophants who terrified him with the truth, refused to listen. He saw the complaints as a lack of patriotism. He retreated further into his fantasy world of maps and uniforms, refusing to visit the bombed-out cities, refusing to see the gaunt faces of his subjects. This abandonment created a vacuum of leadership that the crown prince frantically and futilely tried to fill. Then in March 1917, the earth shook. News arrived from St. Petersburg that shattered the worldview of every monarch in Europe. The Russian Revolution had begun. Tsar Nicholas II, the Kaiser's cousin Nicky, the absolute autocrat of all the Russias, had been forced to abdicate. The shock of this event on Crown Prince Wilhelm cannot be overstated. He had grown up believing that kings were divinely ordained, that their removal was an impossibility, a blasphemy against nature. Yet here was the Tsar, a man who commanded millions, stripped of his power overnight by starving workers and mutinous soldiers. Wilhelm saw the parallels immediately. Russia had collapsed because of a long war, hunger, and a rigid, unresponsive leadership. Germany was fighting a long war, its people were hungry, and its leadership was rigid. The writing was on the wall, written in Cyrillic letters of blood. Panic gripped the crown prince. He realized that if the House of Hohenzollern did not bend, it would break. In a moment of frantic political clarity, he drafted a memorandum to his father. It was a plea for survival. He urged the Kaiser to promise immediate democratic reforms, specifically the reform of the archaic Prussian three-class voting system, which disenfranchised the working class. "We must give the people a stake in the state," Wilhelm argued. "If we do not give it to them, they will take it." It was the most statesmanlike moment of his life. For a brief instant, the playboy vanished, and a desperate pragmatist emerged. He saw that the only way to save the crown was to sacrifice its absolute power. He lobbied the leading politicians. He spoke to the generals. He tried to position himself as the people's prince, the bridge between the old order and the new reality. But he was too late, and he was too weak. The Kaiser, under pressure from conservative circles and his wife, vacillated. When he finally issued the Easter Decree in April 1917, promising reforms after the war, it was seen by the German public as a cynical delay tactic. The moment had passed. The people stopped looking to the palace for salvation and started looking to the streets. The summer of 1917 passed in a haze of political intrigue. The Reichstag, the German parliament, finally found its voice, passing a peace resolution calling for a negotiated end to the war without annexations. The military dictatorship of Hindenburg and Ludendorff was furious. They forced the resignation of the chancellor, Theobald von Bethmann-Hollweg, a moderate whom the Crown Prince had surprisingly supported in his final days. Wilhelm found himself caught in the gears of a machine that was tearing itself apart. He was summoned to Berlin to interview potential replacements for the chancellor, a charade of power that humiliated him. He sat in the room while generals and party leaders dictated the terms. He realized he was being used as a rubber stamp to legitimize the military coup. The resulting appointment of a non-entity, Georg Michaelis, as chancellor, was a disaster that accelerated the slide toward chaos. As 1917 bled into 1918, the situation became a paradox. On the Eastern Front, Russia had completely collapsed. The Bolsheviks had seized power and sued for peace. Germany had won the war in the East. Millions of German troops were freed up to be transported to the West. For a brief, tantalizing moment, the mirage of victory reappeared. Ludendorff conceived a master plan, the Spring Offensive or the Kaiserschlacht. It would be one final colossal roll of the dice. The German army would hurl everything it had at the British and French lines in the West, breaking the stalemate before the growing American army could arrive in decisive numbers. The Crown Prince was skeptical. He commanded Army Group German Crown Prince, which held the center of the line. He knew the state of his troops. They were hungry. Their uniforms were made of paper cloth and stinging nettles. Their trucks had no rubber tires, running on steel rims that clattered on the roads. They were exhausted. "We are asking the impossible of them," he told his staff. But the logic of the gambler took over. There was no other choice. It was victory or total ruin. There could be no negotiation. The Allies were committed to destroying Prussian militarism. So Wilhelm suppressed his doubts and threw himself into the preparations. On March 21, 1918, the great battle began. The scale of the offensive was terrifying. It began with the greatest artillery bombardment in history, a hurricane of gas and high explosives that dissolved the British Fifth Army. The German stormtroopers, using new infiltration tactics, surged forward into the fog. They broke the deadlock. For the first time in 4 years, the front moved. They advanced 40 miles. They captured thousands of prisoners. They threatened the critical railway junction at Amiens. From his headquarters, Wilhelm watched the reports come in with a mixture of hope and dread. The tactical success was undeniable. The British were reeling. But he also saw the cost. The German casualties were horrific. And worse, as his starving troops overran the Allied supply depots, they stopped to loot. German soldiers who had been living on turnip bread and sawdust sausages found British trenches filled with white bread, corned beef, jam, coffee, and cigarettes. They gorged themselves. They got drunk. The advance slowed, not just because of resistance, but because the German army realized just how materially rich their enemy was and how destitute they had become. The offensive rolled on through April and May, a desperate, lunging beast, but it was the energy of a dying man. Every mile gained extended the supply lines. Every soldier killed could not be replaced. The Americans were arriving now, fresh, well-fed, eager boys from Kansas and New York, pouring into France at a rate of 300,000 a month. Wilhelm watched the numbers. He did the math. It was an equation of death that Germany could not solve. By July 1918, the German offensive had run out of steam. They had punched great bulges in the Allied line, but they had failed to break it. They were exhausted, and then the hammer fell. On July 18th, the French and Americans counterattacked at the Marne. It was the turning point. The German armies, overextended and demoralized, began to buckle. Then came August 8th, 1918, the Black Day of the German Army. At the Battle of Amiens, the British launched a massive tank attack. The German lines didn't just break, they dissolved. Entire divisions surrendered. Officers were spat upon by their own retreating men. The discipline that had been the hallmark of the Prussian army for 2 centuries evaporated in the summer heat. Crown Prince Wilhelm stood in his headquarters and stared at the map. The red arrows of the Allies were piercing his front everywhere. He saw the reports of mutiny. He saw the reports of soldiers shouting, "Strike breakers," at reinforcements moving up to the line. He knew with a crystalline, agonizing clarity that it was over. He got into his car and drove to the Supreme Headquarters at Spa to see his father in Ludendorff. The meeting was a study in delusion. The Kaiser was in denial, talking about defensive victories and divine intervention. Ludendorff was on the verge of a nervous breakdown, oscillating between rage and weeping. Wilhelm stood before them, the Prince of Ruin, and finally spoke the truth that no one wanted to hear. "The war's lost," he said, his voice flat and tired. "We must make peace now, while we still have an army left to suppress the revolution at home." But even then, they couldn't do it. The paralysis of the system was total. They dithered. They hoped for a miracle. They talked of strategic withdrawals. They refused to accept the reality that the world they had built was collapsing around their ears. Wilhelm returned to his troops, a commander without an army, a prince without a future. He spent the autumn of 1918 in a state of numbness. He watched the leaves turn gold and fall, just as his battalions were falling. He watched the retreat, the endless columns of gray ghosts shuffling back toward the German border, looking back at France with eyes dead of all hope. The road ahead led only to the abyss. The fires of revolution were already lit in the shipyards of Kiel and the streets of Munich. The golden cage was gone, replaced by a prison of history's making. The Crown Prince waited for the end, not with fear anymore, but with a terrible, heavy resignation. He was about to lose everything: his rank, his home, his country, and his name. The long twilight of the Hohenzollerns had turned into deepest night. The realization that the war was lost was a heavy burden, but the actual physical collapse of the German Empire was a spectacle of chaos that defied even Wilhelm's darkest nightmares. The resignation of the summer gave way to the panic of the fall, transforming the orderly retreat of a disciplined army into a desperate scramble for self-preservation. The Prince of Ruin was no longer just watching a military defeat. He was witnessing the violent death throes of his entire world. The autumn of 1918 was the season of the great unraveling. It was a time when the fabric of reality, which for the German people had been woven from the iron threads of duty, obedience, and imperial invincibility, began to tear apart with a sound like a shriek. Crown Prince Wilhelm, Ludendorff's replacement, a distinctively non-aristocratic Swabian, who held the dagger. Groner spoke with a calm, devastating precision. He told the Kaiser that the army was no longer his. "The army will march home in peace and order under its leaders and commanding generals," Groner said, his voice flat, "but not under the command of your Majesty." The Kaiser exploded. "I demand the obedience of my soldiers," he shouted. "I will lead them." Groner shook his head. "The army has no oath to you anymore, Your Majesty." The silence that followed that sentence was the sound of 500 years of Hohenzollern rule shattering on the floor. Crown Prince Wilhelm stood in the corner, watching his father shrink. He saw the bombast drain away, leaving behind a confused, frightened old man. Wilhelm tried to intervene, suggesting a compromise. Perhaps the Kaiser could abdicate as German emperor, but remain king of Prussia. It was a legalistic fantasy, a desperate attempt to save something from the wreckage. But events in Berlin were moving faster than the telegraph wires could carry them. While they argued in the hotel room at Spa, the revolution in Berlin had reached the Reichstag. Prince Max of Baden, realizing the situation was uncontrollable, took it upon himself to announce the abdication of both the Kaiser and the Crown Prince, without telling either of them. Moments later, the Social Democrat Philipp Scheidemann stepped onto a balcony of the Reichstag and proclaimed the Republic. When the news reached Spa, the Kaiser was destroyed. He had been deposed by a press release. The generals, fearing that the revolutionary sailors were marching on Spa to hang the emperor, told him he had to leave immediately. To where? The Kaiser asked, bewildered. The Netherlands, they said. Neutral ground. And here lies the crux of the Crown Prince's personal tragedy. In the panic of that afternoon, the focus was entirely on saving the father. The son was an afterthought. The Kaiser, terrified of a fate like his cousin Nicholas II, who had been butchered with his family in a Siberian cellar just months earlier, agreed to flee. On the morning of November 10th, the Kaiser's royal train, stripped of its imperial markings, slipped out of the station, heading for the Dutch border. He left without a formal goodbye to his army. He left without a final embrace of his son. He simply ran. Crown Prince Wilhelm was left behind at Spa. He was alone. He stood in the garden of his villa listening to the distant rumble of artillery and the closer shouts of mutinous soldiers. He was 36 years old. He was the commander of an army group that was disintegrating. He was the heir to a throne that no longer existed. For the next 2 days, Wilhelm wrestled with a dilemma that would have broken a stronger man. What should he do? His younger officers, the firebrands who still believed in the code of Teutonic knights, begged him to stay. Die with us, they urged. They wanted him to lead a death ride, to charge into the American lines and die fighting. It would be a glorious end. It would redeem the honor of the dynasty. It would make him a martyr, a legend for the ages. Part of Wilhelm wanted to do it. The romantic in him, the boy who had loved the theater, saw the appeal of the tragic hero's death. It would be clean. It would be final. But the other part of him, the man who had seen the meat grinder of Verdun, the man who knew that death was not glorious, but messy and painful, recoiled. He looked at the faces of the soldiers around him. They didn't want to die for him. They wanted to go home to their wives. If he tried to lead them into a civil war or a suicide charge, they would likely shoot him themselves. There was another option. Stay and help the new republic bring the troops home. He offered his services to the new government in Berlin. "I will lead the army back in good order," he telegraphed. "I am a soldier first." The reply from Berlin was brutal in its brevity. "We do not need you. Go away." He was rejected by his father, rejected by his people, rejected by the new government. He was a man without a country. On November 12, 1918, Crown Prince Wilhelm made the decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He chose survival. He wrote a letter to Hindenburg relieving himself of his command. He packed a few trunks. And then in the dead of night, he climbed into a car with a handful of loyal aides and drove toward the Dutch border. It was a pathetic, ignoble exit. There were no cheering crowds, no flowers, just a small convoy of cars driving through the rain, dodging revolutionary patrols, headlights cutting through the fog of a defeated nation. He was running away. The hero of Longwy was fleeing like a thief in the night. They reached the Dutch border town of Eisden at dawn. The scene was one of excruciating humiliation. The Dutch border guards were not expecting him. They saw a group of German officers in a muddy car and leveled their rifles. Wilhelm had to step out of the car. He stood in the mud, the rain dripping from the brim of his cap. He had to identify himself. "I am the Crown Prince of Germany," he said. The guards were skeptical. They made him wait. For hours, the heir to the Hohenzollern throne stood by the side of the road, smoking cigarette after cigarette, while telegraphs were sent to The Hague. A crowd of Dutch locals gathered. They stared at him. Some jeered. Children pointed. "That's the butcher," they whispered. "That's the man who started the war." He stood there exposed, stripped of the aura of invincibility that had protected him his entire life. He was just a man in a wet coat, shivering in the cold. Finally, the permission came. Queen Wilhelmina of the Netherlands granted him asylum, but on strict conditions. He was to be interned. He was not a guest. He was a political prisoner. He crossed the border. As the barrier gate lowered behind him, he felt a physical severance. He was leaving Germany. He was leaving his wife Cecilia and his 4 young sons in Potsdam, at the mercy of the revolution. He was leaving the graves of his friends. He was leaving his life. The Dutch authorities did not send him to the comfortable castle where his father was staying. They wanted to separate the 2 men, knowing their toxic relationship. The Kaiser went to Dorn. The Crown Prince was sent to the island of Veringen. Even the name sounded desolate. It was an island in the Zuiderzee, a flat, wind-blasted patch of mud and grass connected to the mainland only by a ferry. It was a place of fishermen and farmers, a place where the wind never stopped howling, and the fog rolled in like a gray blanket every afternoon. When Wilhelm arrived there, in late November 1918, the shock was total. He was housed in a small, drafty vicarage in the village of Oosterland. It had no electricity, no running water, and furniture that smelled of damp and age. The silence was the first thing that hit him. For 4 years, his ears had been filled with the roar of cannon, the scream of shells, the shouting of orders. Now there was only the cry of seagulls and the lowing of cows. He sat in the small living room of the vicarage, staring at the wallpaper. He was alone. His staff was reduced to 2 aides who looked as lost as he did. He had no duties, no parades to inspect, no maps to study, no empire to rule. The depression that descended upon him was crushing. He spent days lying in bed staring at the ceiling. He refused to shave. He drank heavily. He was mourning not just his position, but his identity. Who is a crown prince without a crown? He was a ghost in a machine that had been switched off. But the human spirit is a strange, resilient thing. As the winter of 1918 turned into the spring of 1919, Wilhelm began to emerge from his stupor. The boredom was simply too agonizing to bear. He needed to move. He needed to do something. He began to walk. He walked the perimeter of the island, a lonely figure in a long coat, trailed by the local children who were fascinated by this German prince. He began to talk to the locals. The fishermen of Veringen were blunt, simple people. They didn't care about protocol. They didn't bow. They called him Mynheer, and Wilhelm found, to his surprise, that he liked it. He liked the simplicity. He liked the fact that they judged him by how he behaved, not by who his father was. One day, walking through the village of Hippolytushof, he heard the ringing of an anvil. He followed the sound to a local smithy. He stood in the doorway, watching the blacksmith beat glowing iron into shape. The smell of the coal smoke, the heat of the fire, the rhythmic clang of the hammer, it triggered something in him. It was primal. It was real. It was the opposite of the abstract political world that had destroyed him. He asked the blacksmith if he could try. The man, surprised, handed the crown prince a hammer. Wilhelm took off his coat. He rolled up his sleeves. He struck the iron. And in that moment, the blacksmith of Wieringen was born. It became his salvation. Every day, the former commander of the Fifth Army would walk to the smithy. He learned to shoe horses. He learned to forge tools. He would come home covered in soot, his muscles aching, his hands calloused and black. The world press caught wind of it. Photographers flocked to the island. They expected to find a brooding, plotting monarchist. Instead, they found a man in a leather apron, laughing with the local farmers, sweating over a forge. The images went global. The crown prince shoes a horse. The royal blacksmith. To the world, it was a curiosity, a funny footnote to the war. But for Wilhelm, it was a profound therapy. The hammering drowned out the memories of Verdun. The physical labor exhausted him enough to sleep without nightmares. On Wieringen, stripped of his titles, Crown Prince Wilhelm found a strange, melancholy kind of peace. He was no longer the Prince of Ruin. He was just a man trying to fix broken things, one horseshoe at a time. Yet history has a cruel way of refusing to let its ghosts rest. While Wilhelm found a temporary, soot-covered solace on his windy island, the nation he had left behind was mutating into something unrecognizable. The quiet rhythm of the blacksmith's hammer could not drown out the siren call of Berlin forever. The exile was merely an intermission, a deep breath before the crown prince would plunge back into the turbulent waters of a Germany that was drifting dangerously toward a new kind of madness. The year is 1923. While Crown Prince Wilhelm was hammering horseshoes in the misty isolation of Wieringen, the country he had left behind was descending into a madness that defied description. If the war had broken Germany's body, the peace was breaking its mind. The Weimar Republic, the unwanted child of defeat, was convulsing. The French army had occupied the Ruhr industrial region to extract unpaid reparations. In response, the German workers went on strike, and the government printed money to pay them. The result was hyperinflation on a scale the world had never seen. In Berlin, a loaf of bread cost 200 billion marks. People carried wheelbarrows full of cash just to buy a newspaper. The savings of the middle class, the backbone of the old empire, were wiped out in an afternoon. Decent, law-abiding citizens were reduced to begging or prostitution. The moral fabric of the nation was unraveling, and in the vacuum of authority, paramilitary gangs roamed the streets. The communists fought the right-wing Freikorps. Political assassinations became a weekly occurrence. From his island exile, Wilhelm watched this apocalypse through the delay of newspapers. He felt a potent mixture of horror and vindication. See, he thought, this is what happens when you remove the king. Chaos, anarchy, ruin. The blacksmith of Wieringen was growing restless. The therapeutic rhythm of the forge had done its work. It had healed his nerves, but it could not cure his ambition. He was 41 years old. He felt the pull of his homeland like a physical ache. He began to petition the Dutch and German governments for his return. His savior came in the unlikely form of Gustav Stresemann, the new German chancellor. Stresemann was a pragmatist, a man trying to stabilize the sinking ship of state. He calculated that the crown prince, stripped of his army and his father, was no longer a threat. In fact, keeping him in exile made him a martyr for the radical right. Bringing him home as a private citizen would deflate the myth. On the stormy night of November 9th, 1923, exactly 5 years to the day since the collapse of the empire, a car crossed the Dutch-German border. Inside sat Wilhelm. He was not returning as a conqueror. There were no bands, no crowds. He slipped back into his country like a ghost. He headed straight for his estate at Oels in Silesia. When he arrived, the local villagers turned out to greet him with lanterns and hymns. They kissed his hand. They wept. For a brief moment, it felt like the old days. But when the morning came, the reality set in. He was not Imperial Highness anymore. He was just Herr von Hohenzollern. The Wilhelm who returned to Germany in the mid-1920s was a man caught between two worlds. On the surface, he tried to play the role of the English country gentleman. He wore tweed jackets, played golf, and managed his potato harvest. He tried to project an image of dignified retirement. But underneath, the playboy prince was still very much alive and starving for attention. He began to drift back to Berlin. The capital had transformed into the Babylon of the 20s, a neon-lit city of jazz, cabaret, cocaine, and sexual liberation. It was a city that was frantically dancing on the edge of a volcano. Wilhelm threw himself into this world with a desperation that bordered on the pathetic. He was a fixture at the nightclubs, a tall, gaunt figure with the trademark cigarette holder, surrounding himself with bankers, actresses, and social climbers. He had affairs, endless hollow affairs, that made the tabloids and humiliated his wife Cecilia, who remained at the Sicilienhof Palace, maintaining the stiff, frozen dignity of a court that no longer existed. To the liberal press, Wilhelm was a joke, a relic of a failed era trying to stay relevant. But to the millions of Germans who felt humiliated by the war and the inflation, he was still a symbol. He was a living link to a time when Germany was strong, proud, and feared. It was this symbolism that became his drug and ultimately his poison. Wilhelm began to court the right-wing veterans organizations, particularly the Stahlhelm, a massive paramilitary group of ex-soldiers who hated the Republic. He would appear at their rallies, wearing his old Death's Head Hussar uniform, reviewing the parades of gray-haired men who looked at him with adoration. In their eyes, he saw the reflection he wanted. He was still their prince, but he was a prince without a plan. He was politically naive, easily manipulated by flatterers, and possessed a fatal inability to read the changing tides of history. He believed that the Weimar Republic was just a temporary illness and that eventually the German people would beg the Hohenzollerns to return. He just had to wait and be ready. He didn't realize that a shark was swimming in the waters, waiting to swallow him whole. By the late 1920s, a new political force was rising from the gutter of Munich. The National Socialist German Workers' Party, led by the Austrian agitator Adolf Hitler, was gaining momentum. Initially, Wilhelm, like most of the old aristocracy, looked down on the Nazis. He considered Hitler to be vulgar. The Nazis were loud, they were violent, and they had no breeding. Hitler was a corporal. Wilhelm was a field marshal. In the rigid hierarchy of the prince's mind, the distinction was absolute. But as the Great Depression hit in 1929, plunging Germany back into misery, the Nazi vote exploded. Hitler became a force that could not be ignored. And Wilhelm, watching from his estate, began to make a catastrophic calculation. He looked at Hitler and saw a tool. He saw a man who could drum up the masses, a Pied Piper who could destroy the hated Republic and crush the communists. Wilhelm believed that Hitler was a necessary evil, a battering ram to break down the door. Once the door was open, Wilhelm reasoned, the responsible elites, the army, the aristocracy, the monarchy, would step in, push the little corporal aside, and take charge. It was the same delusion that gripped the entire German conservative establishment. They all thought they could tame Hitler. They all thought they were the chess players, and Hitler was the pawn. They were wrong. Hitler was the one flipping the board. The seduction began in 1930. Hermann Göring, a decorated WI fighter ace and a leading Nazi who came from an aristocratic background, acted as the bridge. Göring flattered Wilhelm. He whispered in his ear that the Führer had the deepest respect for the royal house. He hinted that the ultimate goal of the Nazi movement was to restore the glory of Prussia. And what was Prussia without a king? Wilhelm took the bait. In 1931, he met Hitler for the first time. The meeting was a study in contrasts. The tall, elegant, slightly effete prince and the intense, awkward, hypnotic demagogue. Hitler played Wilhelm like a virtuoso. He was deferential. He bowed. He spoke passionately about national resurrection. He was careful never to explicitly promise a restoration of the monarchy, but he left the door wide open, letting Wilhelm fill in the blanks with his own hopes. Wilhelm left the meeting convinced. He is of no importance. A British intelligence report concluded he is a man of limited intelligence and no political future. To prosecute him would only give him a martyrdom he does not deserve. However, the romance with the Nazis was short-lived. Once Hitler seized absolute power in 1933, he had no further use for the crown prince. The restoration of the monarchy was never part of the Nazi plan. Wilhelm was pushed to the margins, watched by the Gestapo, and realized too late that he had been played. During the Second World War, he lived quietly on his estate, a silent witness to the destruction of his country for a second time. When the war ended in 1945, he was arrested by French troops in Austria and held as a high-profile prisoner of war. In October 1945, the French released him. They didn't release him because he was innocent. They released him because he was irrelevant. They opened the cage door and told the old bird he could fly, knowing full well his wings were broken. Wilhelm emerged from captivity into a Germany that had ceased to exist. The map had been redrawn. The lands east of the Oder-Neisse line, Silesia, East Prussia, Posen, were gone, handed over to Poland and the Soviet Union. This had a catastrophic practical implication for the Hohenzollerns. They were bankrupt. Their vast agricultural estates, the source of their wealth for centuries, were now in communist hands. The palaces were looted or turned into orphanages. Ols was gone. Potsdam was in the Soviet zone, behind the rising Iron Curtain. Wilhelm was a refugee in his own country. He had no home. He had very little money. The only property the family retained in the West was the ancestral seat, Hohenzollern Castle, sitting high on a hill in the Swabian Alb, near the town of Hechingen. But the castle was uninhabitable. It was a massive, drafty, neo-Gothic monument, freezing cold in winter, and currently filled with other refugees and family members. It was a museum, not a home. So, the former heir to the German throne moved into a modest, white stucco villa in Hechingen, known as the Fürstenhäuschen, means Little Prince's house. It was a comfortable middle-class home, the kind a doctor or a lawyer might own. It was a shocking come-down for a man born in the Marble Palace. Here, in the shadow of his ancestors' fortress, Wilhelm began his final act, the Ghost of Hechingen. The years from 1946 to 1950 were a gray twilight. Germany was slowly, painfully pulling itself out of the rubble. The economic miracle was just beginning to stir under Chancellor Konrad Adenauer. But it was a republic. It was a democracy. It was looking resolutely forward, toward America and the West. It had absolutely no desire to look back at the Hohenzollerns. Wilhelm became a local curiosity. The people of Heckingen treated him with a mix of respect and pity. They called him Imperial Highness, but they saw him buying his own groceries. They saw him walking with a cane, a bent figure in a trench coat, coughing from a lifetime of heavy smoking. His personal life had completed its disintegration. His wife, Crown Princess Cecilia, did not live with him. She moved to Bad Kissingen, then to a small apartment in Stuttgart. The golden couple of 1905 ended their lives miles apart, separated by bitterness, infidelity, and the sheer exhaustion of their shared tragedy. They remained married on paper, and they met for family occasions, maintaining the facade, but the bond was severed. Wilhelm lived with a female companion, a younger woman who cared for him as his health declined. It was an open secret, another small scandal that nobody really had the energy to care about anymore. But the past wasn't done with him yet. The process of denazification was sweeping through West Germany. Everyone who had held a position of influence had to face a civilian tribunal to determine their level of complicity. Wilhelm tried to avoid it, but he couldn't. The man who had once stood on the balcony of the Berlin Palace to hear the cheers of thousands now had to sit on a wooden chair in a stuffy municipal room and explain why he had worn a swastika armband. It was a humiliating legalistic autopsy of his life. His lawyers argued that he was merely a symbolic figure who had been manipulated. They produced the letters where he criticized Hitler. They pointed to the Gestapo surveillance. The prosecution pointed to the day of Potsdam. They pointed to the letters praising the national uprising. They pointed to the photos of him shaking hands with stormtroopers. In the end, the tribunal classified him as a fellow traveler rather than a major offender. It was a slap on the wrist, but it legally cemented his legacy. He was a man who had walked alongside the devil because he thought it would get him a crown. After the trial, Wilhelm retreated further into the villa in Heckingen. He became a man out of time. He would sit in his armchair by the window, smoking his pipe or cigarette, looking out at the road. He watched the Volkswagen Beetles driving by, the symbol of the new democratic consumerist Germany. He watched the reconstruction trucks. He watched a world that was busy forgetting him. He developed a routine of almost monastic simplicity. He wrote letters to old friends, many of whom were dead or in prison. He read history books, obsessively relitigating the First World War in his mind. If only we had attacked on the right flank. If only Papa hadn't fled. If only... He was haunted by the what-ifs. He was a man drowning in the subjunctive mood. His health began to fail rapidly. The chain smoking had ravaged his heart and lungs. He suffered from circulatory problems. He grew thinner, his face more skull-like, the skin papery and translucent. Yet even in this state of decay, flashes of the old arrogance would surface. He would occasionally issue statements on world affairs which the newspapers would print in the back pages as a novelty. He warned against the Soviet threat. He spoke about the need for European unity, but his voice sounded tinny, like a recording from a wax cylinder played in a digital age. One of the most poignant moments of these final years occurred when a British journalist came to interview him. The journalist expected to find a monster or a bitter recluse. Instead, he found a charming, weary old man who offered him tea and spoke perfect idiomatic English. "You British," Wilhelm said with a sad smile, "you always understood the value of a king. We Germans, we are too absolute. We either worship them or we destroy them. We don't know how to just live with them." It was a rare moment of insight. Wilhelm realized too late that the British monarchy had survived because it adapted, because it served. The Prussian monarchy had died because it demanded, because it ruled. As 1950 turned into 1951, Wilhelm's world shrank to the four walls of his room. He was surrounded by photographs, black and white echoes of the past. Photos of him and Cecilia in the glass coach, photos of his father on the yacht Hohenzollern, photos of his dead son in his Wehrmacht uniform, a necropolis of paper. He began to feel the cold tightening in his chest. The doctor visited frequently. The diagnosis was angina pectoris and advanced sclerosis. The engine was giving out. He spent his final birthday, his 69th, in May 1951. It was a quiet affair. A few loyalists sent flowers. A telegram came from his wife. But the silence from the rest of the nation was deafening. There were no editorials praising his service, no government delegations. To the Federal Republic of Germany, he was just an embarrassing tax resident in the state of Baden-Württemberg. He was a man who had lived too long. He had outlived his empire by 33 years. He had outlived his father by 10 years. He had outlived his reputation. He was a footnote in the history books before he was even dead. The waiting finally ended on a quiet summer morning in July 1951 in the sleepy town of Hechingen. While modern Germany was busy building its economic miracle, looking resolutely toward the West and the future, Wilhelm died of a heart attack in a modest villa beneath his ancestral castle. There was no state vigil, no national grief. The heart that had once raced with the adrenaline of cavalry charges stopped beating in absolute silence. The man born to inherit the earth departed it with barely a whisper, treated by the press not as a fallen monarch, but as a dusty museum exhibit. His funeral was a ceremony of ghosts, the final act of a dead political drama. His coffin, draped in the flag of Prussia, a state that legally no longer existed, was carried up to Hohenzollern Castle by elderly generals and impoverished aristocrats. He was buried to the tune of the soldier's lament, "I had a comrade," a cruel irony for a man who died watching television in a rented house. He was laid to rest, not as a king, but as a historical curiosity, surrounded by the wreckage of a sunken world. History judges Wilhelm not merely as a victim, but as the embodiment of the useful idiot. His greatest failing was a fatal lack of moral courage. From signing senseless death warrants at Verdun out of duty to lending the prestige of his name to the Nazis in a delusional gamble to restore his throne. He represented the hubris of the traditional elites who believed they could dance with the devil and lead, only to prove that when tradition meets fanaticism, tradition is merely kindling. Yet his life remains a poignant study in obsolescence. He was a man stunted by a system that trained him for a job that vanished, leaving him like a surgeon in a world that had abolished medicine. He was the Prince of Ruin, surviving long enough to see the total collapse of everything he represented. The vast distance between the cheering crowds of 1914 and the lonely, coughing old man of 1951